Jake Lawrence here, and you're listening to the Jake Lawrence Podcast, a weekly online radio show dedicated to Chicago industry, technology, and thought leadership. Today's guest is Wayne Duerkes. I keep on calling him Wayne Nelson throughout the show because Wayne Nelson is his Facebook name. So, sorry, Wayne. But anyways, he is very cool, and he's very knowledgeable about history, and especially history in Illinois and Chicago history. So, with that being said, we're sponsored by Corporate Suites Network. Corporate Suites Network is the premier Chicago source of all things corporate housing, short-term rentals, furnished apartments, month-to-month apartment rentals. They are the people that you talk to whenever you need any of those things. csnhousing.com. That is csnhousing.com. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed the podcast episode as much as I did. Thank you so much, Wayne Nelson, for being on the Jake Lawrence Podcast today. I have been looking forward to this for a while, and I cannot wait to get into it with you to talk about U.S. history. How are you doing today, sir?
Really good, really good. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Jake. You know that.
Absolutely. Well, first off, let me say this. I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see Wayne Nelson, Dr. Wayne Nelson soon, being the preeminent 19th century U.S. historian in the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, I would love for that to happen. Give me about a couple years now, and I'll have my dissertation done, and we'll have that doctor in front of my name. And then give me a few more years, and I'll work on that preeminent status for you. I hope so.
Well, hey, Wayne, I was wondering if you could just kind of go into your background and how you came to be where you are, because you're not really a traditional student, right?
No, absolutely not. Actually, I started my collegiate education when I was 37. Out of high school, I went into the Marine Corps and then worked in the corporate world for a while, started my own business. But I was never really happy with it. I wanted more, so went back and got my associates at a local community college in Illinois, Waubonsee. And then I went on to Northern Illinois University to get my bachelor's. And I really fell in love with what I was doing. A lot of excitement with actually getting out of the corporate world. So I went on and got my master's there at Northern. Now I'm at Iowa State University working on my PhD. So it's fair to say I am a non-traditional student for sure.
And, this is kind of a weird thing for at least listeners and the audience to my podcast, because I've had on a lot of guests that are doing the exact opposite. They are getting out of school and they're trying to start businesses, and they're going down that corporate or that entrepreneurial path. So what we see with you, though, is the difference, right? Is you beginning on this path, you going into the Marine Corps, you're going into the corporate world, and then just wanting to change at a pretty late stage in life. Kind of talk to the differences and motivations that people have, you versus the, 25-year-old that wants to get out of grad school to start a tech startup.
Well, yeah, no, the differences obviously seem very obvious on the surface, but my congratulations goes out to those younger people. They grasp what it is they want to do early in life. They have a passion. They're going after it. They're getting that education first, and now they have 20, 30, 40 years doing what it is they want to do. It took me a while to realize what I wanted to do. For me, it was more this thought process of getting out there, getting money, paying the bills, building up a savings account, all that type of stuff. Stuff that obviously needs to be done in this day and age, but was not really fulfilling to me mentally. But when I was going into the Marine Corps, and even when I got out, I was still kind of young at heart, and I needed to get a lot of that out, shall we say. I wasn't clear enough in my own mind which way I was going. So for me, it's kind of, life is in two stages. My first stage of life, which is done and beyond me, and I've been able to harness a lot of the experiences from there and share when I do my student teaching or work with other grad students on issues that they have. And then the second stage now is this looking to fulfill myself intellectually and research and teach and do something entirely different. Whereas my good counterparts out there that are 25 getting out of grad school, going into the world, they've already established what they need to do academically, intellectually, and they will just build up experience over time. So for everyone, I think there's times in their lives where they feel like they're not being fulfilled with their initial path, and that was me. And for a lot of other people out there who went to college early, went into liberal arts and sciences to get a feel for all the different aspects of life that are out there, they've got a good jump on that, and they should have the ability to go much farther than I will ever have the capability to do. So, my huge congratulations out to those people that grasped that very early.
I don't think it's mutually exclusive, though. I think that there's going to be probably a lot of people in my generation that did the academic route first, and later down in their life, they're going to realize that it probably wasn't for them. Or, there's just a large part of the population of people in college right now that are dropping out because they just don't. It's not for them. It's too expensive. They see that college is kind of a trap in some situations. You've heard all these arguments before, Wayne.
Sure.
So I kind of just wanted to bounce that idea off of you that for people that are going out of high school and are entering in academia, the college, pursuing either a bachelor's or a graduate or whatever, what do you say to those critics who say that they shouldn't go in?
Well, every individual has their own motivations, their own thought process, their own dreams. And I think you're 100% right that academic life isn't for everyone. It wasn't for me when I was 18, 19 years old. I was not ready for it. There is that obvious benefit that comes with receiving at least an undergraduate degree in case you're in a profession, a career, a lifestyle that you feel is fulfilling, but you're ready for the next stage after 15, 20 years. Having that undergraduate degree may give you that opportunity for promotion or expansion that your peers without one wouldn't have, and I respect that. But no, there's all types of careers out there that we still need solid people doing the trades, artisan work, that type of stuff that is crucial to the survival of this country. That's, I think, in the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see lots of opportunities in there because there's less people going into those technical fields. So whatever path that you choose to go in out of high school, whether it's collegiate, whether it's military, whether it's into the job world, technical school, cooking school, and anything like that, if it's what you want to do, go for it. I don't think anyone should be hamstring to this aspect that, well, no, right out of high school I have to go to college, otherwise I'll be a failure, because that's not true at all. I didn't go to college for 20-some years, and I was relatively successful, nice house, cars, paid bills, all that type of stuff, had a family. So there's a lot to be said with that aspect of just following your dreams, do what you feel is best for you. Because if you go to college, and you're right, Jake, it is extraordinarily expensive to go to college. And if you go there and you're not in the right frame of mind, you're not going to learn. You're not going to get the full potential that college offers you. And you're going to waste a lot of money in the process. So it has to be a decision that you feel comfortable with as you go out there. And if you need a couple years life experience before you do it to maybe see what the world's like and make some decisions, I would tell a high school student, if you have the opportunity, take those couple of years and go out there and see what's available.
That's probably really good advice. And it's unique to everyone. So doing these wide generalizations is kind of difficult to do, and it's probably a little reckless as well. But I wanted to get into U.S. history a little bit and kind of narrow down our focus to what you're specifically researching. But I can't get away from this idea of you being the very non-traditional student, mingling and doing all the research opportunities and the extracurricular things with, 20 somethings. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about what that experience was like, being so different, having a 2-decade difference and being in the same courses and classes and research opportunities, like I said. Were you the type of person that was the mentor to everyone else because you've had all these experiences, or what?
Well, that's a very interesting question that I've actually thought about quite a bit, especially after the undergraduate experience, because if you don't mind me saying, when I was at Northern, there's this opportunity you had with research rookies. And it was something that the university it was an extracurricular activity where individuals from every field could come in and research whatever they wanted to with the help of a university level mentor. And it was an opportunity I took advantage of. And I remember being at those meetings, and here I am, this 39, 40-year-old gentleman in with all these 20-year-olds. And it could have been something that I felt like I was divorced from the group if I allowed that, but that was not the case. I was there to get an education, to experience the whole collegiate aspect, just like I was in my early or late teens, early 20s, shall we say. And at Northern, with Northern being kind of half non-traditional and half traditional, the whole campus made me fit right in. And it was not really my initial goal to go in there and be the mentor type, because you see a lot of it in a lot of classes where you get the non-traditional students, and some of them will act like, well, just trust me, I know, listen to my great experience, blah, blah. And they kind of push that on to the other students. And it's actually, when you sit back and watch that whole process, it looks really repellent to the younger students. I already got a professor or a TA hounding me. I don't need another student telling me. They're learning for themselves. So my process with that was always just to act like another student, to be there and learn. And if someone, came to me and asked for advice or wanted to talk to me, just open up that standard communication, that listening, that talking, and, just try to be buddies with them, male or female. And I think that process really seemed to work for me, because a lot of individuals that I met at Northern, we seemed to click very well. You, for instance, we met in research rookies, and I hope I didn't come across as the old man, I know better type aspect. I just try to come across as your normal, everyday student. And once again, it just seemed to work better for me. And when you communicate with someone respectfully, not overbearing or something like that, they want to communicate with you. And that's the best aspect of college for me, was the ability to make friends and talk intellectually about stuff. And then once you built up a little trust there, you were able to talk socially and everything like that. And things it made the whole process that much better for me, I feel. Because there was lots of people at the university, other students who were not traditional, that, they always talk, well, I can't connect with anyone. They're so young or something like that. And you have to put yourself in that mindset that you're not going to create a difference between you two. The connection between you two is the fact you're both students looking to better yourself. So start with that even plane, because there was a lot I felt I could teach students if they wanted to know, fellow students, and there was so much I learned from everyone that I connected with. It was really nice to learn from professors and my fellow students, people that were older than me and people that were younger than me, and that social aspect of learning, that networking aspect of learning, that is a part of the university life that a lot of people don't pick up on, extraordinarily beneficial. To me, it was.
That's great advice. And I hear a lot of wisdom coming from you. And I hear a lot of just good, honest experience that you brought into going into the university for the first time. And really, I think it ought to be exactly how it is with you for everyone. I don't think it should be you turn 18, you go to a college. I think it is you turn 40 and then you should go to college, because you don't like Wayne, you had all the right skill sets, the right mentality, the right like wisdom to go into that environment and to get everything out of it that everyone else was trying to, but seemed to just not accomplish. I was wondering.
That's one of the,
Yeah, no, go on.
downfalls of university life, I think. And please, I mean this with absolute respect to the individuals. When they go from high school to college to grad school to teaching, and they never leave the university world, you're in this sheltered environment where you don't experience the same thing that individuals in the corporate, business, military world, what have you, does. When you're 18 or 19 and you're working for minimum wage at a Walmart or a Burger King or something like that to do stuff, and that's how you survive, not how you make extra money to get to the next semester or something like that, but that's how you survive. You pick up worldly traits that academia doesn't offer. They can't offer. It's a real world experience that makes a difference. And there's a lot of those professors that have been in that boat where they've never left academia. They're absolutely brilliant people. I mean, absolutely brilliant. Whatever field they're in, you could ask them almost anything you want, and they'll either know the answer or know how to get the answer. They're just geniuses, and they're going to do wonderful in the field. But that ability to connect with the individual students becomes problematic because there's a social connection loss there between the people teaching and those that want to learn. Okay, if you've never known anything but academics, you don't really know how to teach someone who is balancing kids and spouses and jobs and cruddy jobs at that, plus part-time work. So, it's one of those aspects that going straight from 17, 18 into college because you're told to, because society tells you, your parents tell you to, that's one thing. But if you're not ready to learn, if you're not prepared to learn, and high school really doesn't make you prepared to learn what college really should be teaching you, sometimes that worldly experience, and it doesn't have to be 20 years like I did, but even a year or two, getting a feel for what it's like to survive on your own, I think it helps students appreciate what they can learn at college. And a lot of my conversations with students, my fellow students who talked about that was their kind of thing. They weren't sure what they wanted to do. They didn't know why. They weren't even sure why they were in college. And just talking to them about, options in life and stuff like that, I think, or based on my conversations with them or my perceptions, is that, it was beneficial. But it's really hard to teach someone when they just feel like they're required to go there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I do want to talk about U.S. history, and I do want to talk about your specific research. But before we kind of jump into that, I was wondering if we could gloss over, or you can provide a quick summary of your bona fides. What exactly did you accomplish in undergrad and in grad school? And what are you aiming to do now getting a doctorate? Like, what's your end goal?
Well, I mean, do you want a whole CV of the undergraduate, or I mean, just the highlights? What are you looking for here? I mean,
yeah, just the highlights would be good.
The biggest thing out of my undergraduate aspect was I got the one award at Northern Illinois University that was the University Honor Scholar. It was the very first time that they offered it, and me and another wonderful gal got it the very first year. So that was cool, kind of setting the bar for what University Honor Scholars should be. Of course, at the end, being the top senior, the Lincoln Laureate, was a huge honor for me, something to share with my friends and family, the accomplishments of what a non-traditional student can do when they really put their heart and mind into their education. And then I was able to get an article published in the Journal of the Illinois Illinois State Historical Society, on Civil War motivations from Northern Illinois. So those were kind of like the three big ones that really meant a lot to me to carry on.
Yeah, so as far as your graduate career went?
Graduate was even better, and that's one of the nice things when you really want to focus on a field. And once again, this is someone who knows why they're going to undergraduate and then loves it and then wants to focus on the field. Because when you get into graduate school, for me anyway, it was like, okay, the electives are done, the gen eds are done, all those other fields. Now I get to spend my whole time studying what I want to study, and that's history. So all those questions that I had before about history, we could expand on. We could learn more. I was spending all my time doing that. And they kind of say that undergraduate is, you're just learning the basics of your field. At the master's level, you're kind of learning what the history is, kind of what is the conversation among historians. And then at the PhD level, it is you actually participate within that conversation. So it was a remarkable journey once I got up to there. I guess, obviously, for me, my end goal has always been going for PhD so that I can teach. I would love to actually teach at the university level, college level, what have you, and help shape young minds and let them understand there's a lot to gain from history. It is not static. It is very fluid, and there's lots of takeaways from history. So that has been my end goal, and everything I've done along that from undergraduate to this point has been in developing a CV, going to conferences, doing papers, getting scholarships, awards, all that type of stuff, so that hopefully I can make myself marketable once I finish the dissertation.
And again, I just kind of want to stress that, Wayne, you're the prime example, of what a non-traditional student can do and can accomplish. You are the the Lincoln Laureate, for Christ's sake. You know what I mean? As a non-traditional student, that's I think was kind of unheard of, but you're doing everything right because you had that successful mentality going into it. So I just want to stress to everyone and to all the audience and to all the listeners who might be in the same situation where they might want to go back to college because they want to do X, Y, or Z things. Having the mentality to want to learn is the first and most fundamental step.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think what I'm hearing from you too, Wayne, is that the next step is having a clear and a very established plan and goal going forward.
That becomes key. And I don't want anyone to think, oh my God, well, I'm very interested in going to college, but I don't have a clear plan, so I need to stop what I'm doing. That's not the case at all. You know me, Jake, even in my undergraduate, when in my off time, I was researching the field, what the job market was like, what did successful historians do, what did not successful historians do. I really wanted to continue to learn about not just history, because I absolutely love that, but the life and lifestyle of a historian, a successful historian. And as I learned bits and pieces, my plan continued to adjust. You have to be fluid that way. But when I came in, I knew exactly what major I wanted to do. I knew what time frame, and for historians, that's a key thing, what I wanted to study. But there's been slight deviations in the path based on what I've learned from talking to all these professors. Going to office hours to help in class is one thing, but I spend most of my time in office hours asking them what it's like. What it's like to be a historian. What's it like to be a successful historian? In history, what's it like to read correctly? Because, it's one thing to read as if you're reading Harry Potter or something like that. But when you're reading history, it's an entirely different type of reading. What your takeaway is, shall we say. So I spent many hours, and most of the professors at NIU could tell you that, just picking their brains so that I could adjust my plan for the better, hopefully, in a lot of those things. So even if you're going, yes.
Wayne, I totally agree that if you don't have a plan, then yeah, it shouldn't stop you from going to college. But I'm also hearing from you that your plan changed, it deviated, and it's also really important to be flexible and to adapt to any changes and to new information,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, if you're not willing to adapt, then I think you're not ready for college life, actually, because that's what college life is adapting. You should go in there with an open mind to learn. Learn from all your courses, even if they're not within your major, because they all add to that. So if you're going to go in there with a closed mind, this is exactly what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to learn. This is what I'm going to take away from it. End of story. You're missing out on the opportunities. So much of those opportunities. And
yeah, and I think too, and you don't have to endorse this at all, but what I'm hearing from Wayne and all my experiences with Wayne, from the last X amount of years is if you're going into college for something, be a geek about it. Totally geek. You need to be totally geeking out about it on your off time, and you need to be thinking about it a lot. And if you don't have that geekiness, if you don't have that passion towards your subject, then you're going to be a failure 100%, or even worse is you're going to succeed at your topic or your subject or your major, and then you're going to hate your actual job going afterwards. You're going to be stuck in a cubicle and you're going to be thinking, why in the hell did I do X? Or why in the hell did I do Y? But if you geek out about it before going to college, if you geek out about it during college, well, you're going to be success. You're going to be a successful whatever it is that you're trying to do. And I hope I didn't scare you off, Wayne. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I don't know if I would go so far as you're going to be a total failure. But yeah, the geeking out aspect of it, okay, anyone who's lived a life knows that once you get past your education, you go out into your career becomes a lifestyle. It's not just a job. It's just not a 9 to 5. Okay, it encompasses your entire life is encompassed by this career. So if you don't love what you're doing, if you're not geeking out about it, then it may not be that you're not going to be a failure. It's just you're not going to be happy the whole time. And maybe the fact that you're not geeking out about it is kind of indicative of the fact that this may not be the field. This may not be where you want to go with this type of thing. But if you love it so much that you're talking about it all the time, you're researching in your off time. And yes, we're all human. We need other avenues of escape, Netflix or Facebook or hanging out with our friends over a cold beer or something like that. That's all fine. Otherwise, if you're not preparing yourself for the field long term, you're almost seeing that you're going to be unhappy later on in life. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a real big aspect of thinking about this major as being the rest of your life. Now, granted, you can get certain majors and go off into other fields and everything like that, but you're just not connecting with it all. I was making a lot of money in the corporate world, doing very well, but I was never happy. Now, I'm still a student, so I'm making very little money, but I'm extraordinarily happy. Every day, I'm happy about getting up, doing what I have to do. I think about what I have to read next, what I have to research next, how this is going to work for this dissertation, thinking about possibilities for the next book, thinking about how I want to teach. Okay, it didn't work this way. How can I teach another way? How can I read about teaching to connect with my students more? It's become a lifestyle, and it's not work. I mean, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. I have to put in hours and hours for it. But to me, it's not work. It's life. So there's such a big difference.
Wayne, you brought up teaching, and that's not really a topic that we've, personally talked about ever. And knowing what you know and knowing your life experiences and just your mentality about work, life, and history, how do you connect with history students, and how do you try to tell the story of our history?
Well, and that's the best thing about history, is because history is a story. Now, connecting with students is not always the easiest thing. I'm here at Iowa State University. It's a Tier 1 research institute, lots of STEM students that are brilliant at what they're doing. And history kind of is like this general elective or course requirement I have to take to get to the next stage. So you know that most students really don't want to be there. So the key thing I feel when it comes to teaching those students is connect with them with why they should be there. There is something in history. There are lessons to be learned. There's stories to be told, and there's takeaways from history that go into any other field out there, no matter where you go. And for college level history, it's not this aspect of remember this date, remember the order of the presidents, remember that date, or any, that's Wikipedia stuff that you can look up online in seconds. The important aspect is the why, the how, the story. What does this story tell us about who these people were and who we are? How does it all connect? So when up there, and I've had the opportunity of giving several lectures, when I tell lectures, it's all a story. And telling that story the whole time, but I begin with what the expectations are, what's your takeaway, where you should think about, or what you should be thinking about by the end of this. And then at the end, I recap that. And when anyone, a student, a worker, a human being, knows what their expectations are, they can think about that as the job's happening, as the lecture's going, as anything is happening, so that when they're done, they can think, oh, okay, as it was going, here's my takeaways, here's the things I should be thinking about. So it's all this aspect of connecting with the students with the relatability, shall we say, of what any old historic story has with them and their potential future.
What do you usually lecture about?
Luckily for me, most of my lectures have been within the 19th century time frame. I've done 19th century U.S. history lectures, and I've also done one European lecture on the 1848 revolutions. 19th century is where I'm most happy. I am most knowledgeable, shall we say. The 20th century, I know quite a bit. I've lived through a third of it, so I know a lot about those. But luckily for me, most of my lectures have been in that 19th century time frame. We also, here at ISU, TAs are assigned recitation periods. So I have 4 separate recitation periods that are 50 minutes apiece with about 25 students apiece. So I have about 100 students a semester where we talk about primary sources or stories, or it's just your standard recitation depending on where the particular professor wants to go on delving deeper into that history aspect. So the TAs have a real ability to connect with the students on a one-on-one level, whereas the professors, they have 160, 200 students. They don't have that ability.
What was it like doing your first lecture up there? Were you terrified?
No, not at all. Not at all. When I was in the Marine Corps, I had just come back from training, the initial MOS training, military occupational specialty training, and one of the officers asked me, "You just got back. Do you understand the new breakdown of how the organization is going to be run?" I said, "Yes, sir. I know all about it." They said, "Good. Well, the slides are up there." And they opened the door and they pushed me out. And I walked out in front of a stage with like 100 officers and staff sergeants and stuff like that. And I had no time to think about it. I knew the material and I just rolled in. After that moment, I had no fear of teaching because I didn't have time to think about it. And I learned immediately, if you know what you're talking about, they all want to hear you. So just go with it. And when it comes to the history, by the time I actually give the lecture, there's so much prep that goes into it, reading to make sure that it's solid information, that to me it's just this wonderful opportunity to have 160, 200 students as a captive audience hearing your story. So no, I look forward to lectures. I've never been scared of them at all. And I think that's one benefit I have over a lot of my peer group. Yeah, I know when you can't think about it, it's hard to get scared about it.
Yeah, baptism by fire.
Absolutely.
Right?
It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Because I mean, I just felt him grab my arm, open the door, and push me in. It's like, what? Oh. And the guy just clicked the first slide, and I just, it was off the cuff. It didn't have to be anything official or prepared, but and it wasn't that long, but it was enough to just break me of that fear aspect right away. And now I just love an audience.
Yeah, I bet. Well, that's great, man. I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying the lecture aspects of your job. Being a TA, and you said something earlier that I kind of wanted to connect the dots real quick. You were talking about how to read history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're talking about that you do a lot of prep work and that you're reading for these lectures. And by the way, the European 1848 revolutions, I'm putting like a footnote here. I'll link that. I'll link some good articles at the end of
sure.
my article on my website, jakelawrencepodcast.com to it. And if we talk about it later, there's going to be a bonus point for you. Anyways, how to read history. Kind of wanted to talk about Wayne has a small library in his house, and small is a hilarious word to describe it because it is nothing but small. It is just massive, and he reads so much, and he has so many books. Wayne, can you describe your library for us?
It is, well, massive is a fair way to put it. I've been reading history for a couple of decades now, so I've been adding to my collection for years. And then once you get into the actual academic aspect of it, the books just come pouring in. My entire basement is full from side to side, front to back with books. Individual volumes, it's about 4,000 volumes right now, not including all the periodicals and stuff like that. And it was
4,000?
Yeah, 4,000. A little over 4,000 right now. So it keeps. Most of it I've read. There's obviously reference books and stuff like that. You don't read the entire thing, shall we say, but they're there for when you need them. But the ability to have those books at my beck and call versus going all the way to the library back and forth has been extraordinarily beneficial. And then having some of my fellow students over, some of the books in my field that libraries don't have, they can come here and they can study here. I've got an extra table and stuff like that. So the ability to have your own personal library that others can use has always been a nice way of connecting and bonding with other people also. So yeah, it's there's a lot involved in that library.
So Wayne, I write an article for each podcast, and I do like all the show notes, right? All like the show notes of everything that we talked about in order chronologically throughout the podcast, and I link it at the very end of the article. And I think what would be really cool for the audience would be a couple pictures of your library. Is that something that you'd be comfortable with?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, not a problem at all.
All right. Excellent. Okay, cool. So my question is, okay, you have over 4,000 books. You say you've read them all, and
most of them.
We had a conversation. Sure. And we had a conversation the other day about just how much reading you do, like 2 to 3 books a day. And you dropped a little nugget earlier about you going into professors' office hours and talking to them about what it means to be a successful historian and how to critically read. So how do you read? And how is it different than other subjects? And how have you been able to accomplish to read all of those books?
Okay. Well, obviously, I need to throw out that, once again, I've been reading for a couple of decades. There are books in my library that I've had for 20 years that I read a long time ago. So I don't want anyone to think that in the last 5 years I've read that many books. And when you read history, it's different from reading a fiction book. A fiction book, You read from cover to cover, every single word. You're trying to get all this. History is a little bit different. Now, obviously, when you're an undergraduate or even in the master's level, when you're assigned individual books where you're assigned maybe 1 or 2 or 3 books a week, then you should be reading the entire thing. You're getting their argument, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute here because their argument is huge. And, you're learning about writing styles and developing arguments and also pulling out little facts and bits of information that may be necessary for your individual research. Right now, I'm actually studying for my comps. That means all my coursework, required coursework, is done, and there's comprehensive exams that I have to take in August. So I have to read these 400 and some odd books in 8 months and be prepared to answer. I have to do written exams on them and then an oral exam. And a lot of the books, the key thing is you take it and you read the introduction really close, you read the conclusion really close, and then you do some skim reading in between. And what you're looking for is, what does this general author say about this subject? And then let's say it's about the Revolutionary War or the effects of the Revolutionary War. Well, you read 15, 20 books on the long-term effects of the Revolutionary War and the Constitution, republicanism, democracy, all that. You start to get a feel that there's a historiography, or what historians have said about the subject, and how that historiography relates to what comes next in the early Republic or the antebellum period. And being able to compare these different arguments, because what historians do is not just put together a bunch of facts. Anyone can do that, shall we say. It doesn't take a lot of training to put together the facts. But the hard part of what historians do is the interpretation of all those facts. What do all these primary sources, these newspapers, these letters, these journals, these census data, what does it all mean? What does it mean to the period then, for us to understand what was going on then? And how does it build collectively throughout time to create our U.S. history or French history or whatever you study? So the interpretation aspect is key. And when historians get done doing this, they interpret it. They put in there what they feel is their argument of how we should interpret the Revolutionary War in this instance. And obviously different people look at it different ways, because initially, most history was white man's history. Okay, it wasn't until the 70s that social history came up, and we started considering, well, hey, there's Black Americans, there's female Americans, there's American Indians, there's immigrants coming in. How did they contribute? And then when we look at the white man's history, well, there was the property owners and there were the non-property owners. And you start putting all these pictures together, and then you look at them north and south and within different regions. Each tell different stories, and each has little interpretations that go with it. So potentially someone's interpretation of it from the 1970s may not gel well today because it wasn't all inclusive with women's, blacks, American Indians. So you have to see how people have changed the historiography, the story of the effects over time. So when you're reading a lot of these books for the comps, it's pulling out these arguments. Okay, so if Jake argues this, and Wayne argues this, and Jim argues this, and Amy argues that, what are all these historians saying, and what path do I want to go on? If I'm studying the early Republic, which comes after the Revolutionary War into the antebellum period, what arguments that Jake and Wayne and Amy said lend credence to the development of my argument? So it's a lot of picking out these big facts, and that's how you can do 3-4 books a day, because you're gutting the book for the main arguments and then moving on. Now, obviously, when you're reading about your own particular era, the early Republic antebellum period, you have to pay a lot closer attention to that, because you're going to be writing about this. You're a specialist in this field. You need more than just the argument. You want to hear the details. You want to hear the stories, because it's your field. shall we say. So you connect closer with that. So it's easy to gut books that are written in historic thing. It becomes kind of problematic when you get to a book that's within your field because you're really interested in the subject matter, but you have to kind of ward yourself off from reading word for word. And then when you get those books that are written in the narrative style, then they're just like, they're very hard to gut because it's all story and the argument you have to pick out of multiple chapters.
I think it's interesting to hear you use like hunting terminology when you're talking about this. Having to gut a book. I think that's spot on. Can you kind of touch a little bit, just briefly, on the importance of primary sources and just how many primary sources there are for your time period?
Oh wow! Well, basically, in case the audience doesn't know what a primary source is a source that was written during the time frame that we're studying. So newspapers, letters, diaries, anything like that during whatever time frame you're individually studying, government papers. What's different from that is secondary sources, and that's what historians have wrote. So primary sources are everything. It is our window into the past. We can't sit there and talk to these individuals from the 1830s or 40s or before that. We can't interview them. There's no audio recordings. So the only way we can truly see what was happening during that time frame is by whatever was left behind by them in written source. And so, once again, reading what they're publishing in newspapers. What did local, state, federal governments come up with? What legislation did they come up with and why? Court cases, probate records, wills, the classics, diaries and journals and letters and all that kind of stuff. So without those, we have no history. We have no way of examining the history. We can't see into there. And one of the reasons I picked the 19th century, not only because I absolutely love it, but I think there's a balance of primary sources to work with. When you start getting into the 20th century, there's so much to work with. It becomes, to me, problematic to get through it all to find out what you're looking for. Tax law in Illinois in 1848 is a 300-page book. Tax law today in the state of Illinois is volume upon volume. Now, look at the federal government, all that type of stuff. You're just talking massive quantities. There was several hundred newspapers in the country to look at in the 1840s. There's several thousand to look at now. So it becomes really hard to start picking through all that data. Conversely, you go back to the 18th century and sources become very sparse because there was literacy issues. Not a lot of people could read or write. The ones that did, they're busy living lives. They weren't writing journals, writing diaries as prolifically as they were in the 19th century. There wasn't as many newspapers. There wasn't as many states, so there wasn't as many state laws going on. So I think my time frame as far as primary sources go is this nice balance of enough to work with, but not too much to overwhelm me. But at the same time, what's that?
Yeah. It's funny. I was just listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and he has this 3-part show about the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire from 550 BCE to 330 BCE. And the main author of almost all the stories and all the information we know about that period is Herodotus. And without Herodotus, all of that history, all of that story isn't colorized at all. And we don't really know really anything. And then we look at after Herodotus, the color palette kind of goes back to black and white. And we see a figure like Alexander the Great, who is just mythologized to a point of really no other, general at that point in history, especially a European general, especially not one from Macedonia. But we know now that the only primary source we have from Alexander the Great's life is one line from a temple statue. That is it. Literally it. All the other sources we have are writers and authors 300 to 400 years after his death.
Yeah, and they were writing for a certain audience. They were telling a story to, as you say, put them in mythology. Okay, the great Alexander the Great. They don't look at Alexander the Great, the guy who made mistakes or had faults. They don't talk about Alexander the Great, the normal guy, how he lived. So you're obviously you're correct in what you're discussing, and you're also this very biased story that we have, and then any other thing to complement that is strictly what archaeologists come up with. So for my friends that work in those realms of history and try to interpret that, I have the utmost respect for them, because you're working with a very, very small source base, to say the very least. And of course, there's that lovely joy of translating old languages to begin with, too. So I can do a little German, but that's about it.
Well, hey, that's a really cool way. I didn't know that about you, and I didn't know that was kind of your motivation about picking your time period, because that you're absolutely right. Before the 19th century, too little primary sources. After the 19th century, too many primary sources. So you're right. I think there's a really cool balance that you're talking about here. In terms of bias, though, and we know that there was some bias when we read, the authors talking about Alexander the Great. We know there's biases.
Sure.
In other types of situations, as well. Those authors want to pick Alexander and to mythologize him as the great European leader striding into Asia, and just like cutting the heads off of everyone and never losing a battle and being just and kind, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there has to be, though, some pretty severe bias in terms of the antebellum period. Would you like to go into that?
There's no way of avoiding bias at all. Everyone is human. They have their own perspectives on things. It's one of the things, though, that I think the field of history, and one of the things they push throughout the graduate program at both the MA and the PhD level, is this: you're interpreting these sources as best you can, but you have to use the sources. There has to be some evidence behind the argument that you're portraying. Now, granted, when you start talking about issues in the antebellum period or any other period that are still sensitive issues today, and one of the things that pops up right away when I think about that jumped in my head, Andrew Jackson and his treatment of American Indians in the 1830s. Okay. This mistreatment of Indians then and throughout time, before then and up to today, it causes a lot of hostility and resentment in individuals that see it. But your professionally trained historian attempts to put that in the back and tries to interpret the data directly for what it is. Was Andrew Jackson just a man of his times? Was he truly racist? What have you? These are arguments that are never settled, and that there are people that will say that, well, he's just a man of his times. Some people say, no, he's a complete racist type of thing. Is a racist, is that a term that is correct to personify someone from the 1830s and 40s when it was the way that life was? I mean, they didn't know life without those type of racist things. Are we implying 21st century thought processes and values on someone way back when it might not potentially be fair. And
Wayne, can I cut you off for a second?
yes.
Sorry, I'm cutting you off, but I've heard you talk about this before, and I've heard many other people say the same thing. And the first time I heard it, and this may be the same reaction that other people are experiencing right now too, is the first time I heard it was, no, Andrew Jackson was a dirty racist. Slavery was wrong, and everyone knew it was wrong. And if I was there at that period, I would have stopped slavery, and I would have never done any of those things.
I've heard that argument before, sure.
So how do you reconcile that feeling, that kind of gut feeling, and then how do you reconcile it with your own objective reasoning when you're talking about this time period? Because you are most certainly right. People are born from their time and from their culture and from their peers and how they were raised and how the generations before them were raised as well.
Well, and that becomes part of the difficult role of being a historian. It's hard not to judge someone based on what we know here and now. I mean, hopefully there's no one around today that would say that slavery was a good thing. Slavery was bad, was always bad. And yes, many people even back then knew it was bad, but it was just so ingrained in society. So do we judge them today based on our values today, or do we attempt to judge them based on their values then? It becomes very hard, because if all we do is judge them based on values today, then everything in the past was horrific. Everyone was bad. There was no redeeming qualities, and that's not necessarily the case. And issues like treatment of American Indians, slavery, treatment of women over the time frames. Yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's all bad. But we have to think about what's going on at the time and the progress that was being made. It is such a interesting thing to hear someone say, well, if I was then, I knew it was bad and I would just make it stop right away. And, it's like today, if 100, 200 years from now, someone said that owning pets was bad, and everyone 200 years from now knew that owning pets was bad, are you going to come back to 2017 and just make everyone instantly think that owning pets was bad? I mean, you're talking about a societal shift. Those things don't happen overnight. They don't go quickly. So I would just
and I didn't mean to equivocate here, and I didn't mean to paint you as a slavery apologist.
No, I know. We have to be careful on how we're judging them, because once again, society was different at that time frame. So
yeah, and I think it's important to also add, when you're talking about this future scenario of people coming back to tell us the virtues of not owning pets. You're right. It is a paradigm shifting change in culture. Not only that, but all of the cultural incentives, carrots and sticks should be rearranged then to not own pets. And if we're going to be comparing pets to slaves, I probably think that's not a good route to go down. But
no, but it's just very hard to come up with a corollary to slavery.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, all the carrots and sticks in the culture pointed to slavery. All the cultural incentives pointed to slavery, and how you were raised from generations and not just generations, okay, but since the dawn of time we're talking about here. And so anyways, that's a pretty big evolutionary push towards slavery too, if we're talking about purely in the 19th century. Am I hitting anything on the head right now, Wayne?
Well, no. slavery is still important to study today because slavery is still an issue today. Slavery has not gone away. I mean, even if you just think about sex slavery that is occurring around the globe, okay, we should be learning about what occurred with chattel slavery in America in the antebellum period and the horrific effects that had on generations of African Americans, and thinking about that and correlating with these generations of young girls and women that have been forced into sex slavery and the horrendous effects that they're going to have. So it's not like, okay, well, slavery's done and over with, so we'll just learn from it and chalk it up to bad history. That's not the case. A lot of these things that occurred back in the day that we look at as horrific unfortunately are still happening in different parts of the globe. So there's always something to learn from these, if that makes sense.
Okay. No, absolutely. Man, you got me all riled up there. Jeez. Well, no, I think it's important, and I think what you just said there is a pretty good transition. What we're learning from your time period can have real world impacts on how we think about real world issues that are currently happening. So it's not your job as the historian to be the moral judge of what's happening. You are there to do a singular task, and that is to do history well. And if you do history well enough, then I think it really can affect the way that we think about things today, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Doing history well is telling that story properly, factually, that allows my reading audience to understand my argument, to interpret it and see what lessons they can learn and apply to their individual everyday lives, or if nothing else, have a better understanding of where we came from, what we did in the past. So, yeah, I mean, my job, I feel, is not to, okay, I am the judge, jury, and executioner, and when I see something bad in history, is to report it so that everyone knows it's bad.
Sure. And I think we've gone on a couple of tangents so far, but
that would not be the first time we've gone on a tangent, my friend.
But I think we've maintained ourselves a little bit in the pocket so far. And I think where we've been trying to row this entire time, at least I've been, is what is the story of your time period, Wayne? Like, what is the narrative of what you research right now, and why is it important to us today?
Oh, absolutely. No, and this is actually the main reason I picked 19th century. Really, is not so much the sources. It's just when I've always been fascinated by history. I've always been fascinated by Midwest history because I'm a Midwest boy. I love Illinois. I love the Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa. I love Chicago. The whole aspect of it, after a while, okay, that's enough East Coast stuff. What's going on in the Midwest? Why is the Midwest always overlooked? And reading about it, I always started with those local histories. And when you look at the local histories, they pick up like real strong in the 1870s because U.S. Grant, the president, kind of had this movement going on to get people to document what their local boys did in the Civil War. So all the way from the Pleistocene era to the Civil War is crammed into one brief chapter, and then it goes on to the Civil War and then into the 70s and stuff like that. And I always want to know, well, what happened, when in those early years, what happened in the antebellum, what happened in the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, the 20s in the Midwest? Because the way you read those, it's like, well, the Ice Age came, it created lakes, created the soil. Here's the first guy that came to the county, and boom, we're in the Civil War. So there was a huge research gap or a huge gap in the story of what was occurring within these Midwest rural areas. And I emphasize the rural areas because places like Chicago, and I love Chicago, don't get me wrong, there's a whole plethora of books on it. So, urbanity seems to have this focus on it, which makes a lot of sense. But I was born in a small rural town in Illinois. What was going on then in those days? And the more I looked into it, the more I discovered there was less and less told about those areas. So I felt, what? That's not the whole story of the United States if there are pockets of research that haven't been done yet. So I wanted to fill one of those up. As I discovered through my initial research, my research area, which is now north central Illinois, consisting of DeKalb, LaSalle, Kendall, Kane counties, this was a highly productive, very influential region that actually helped build Chicago. Chicago would have never got off the ground if it wasn't for this particular region. And this region became this economic battlefield between the long-standing St. Louis that, if you flowed down the Illinois River, would eventually come to, that connected with New Orleans, and this upstart community called Chicago. So, doing more research, there was a gentleman by the name of Belcher that did this study that said, well, when the railroads came through, that's when it became this real rivalry. Well, my research is saying, well, no, it's actually a good 10, 15 years before that, with the coming of the canals and the rivers and stuff like that. So the more I investigated from the local histories into the very Spartan regional histories, it became evident that my research region had a story to tell from this time frame, and that is what I'm going out to tell, that it was extraordinarily important in the market for both northern Illinois and the Midwest. And then, I'm finding out even more that there was a strong connection between my region and England with the grain crops. So the story keeps expanding. So how did this market develop? How did it connect? And how did it help with this aspect of Western migration, Western expansion that was occurring in the early Republic antebellum period?
Wayne?
Yeah.
Can I ask you to kind of briefly touch on what was happening in the more broader sense in this time period, and then kind of focus more microscopically on the smaller region that we're talking about now, because I don't want the audience to miss out on kind of the geo and economic political factors that are completely surrounding the research focus areas that you're talking about right now.
Okay, well, I will attempt to do that in a succinct manner, because it can go on for a while, to say the very least.
You have 2 minutes. Now go.
No, well, if you think about the time frame, and I'm starting in the early 1830s, this aspect of Western migration is occurring. Okay, obviously by now the Louisiana Purchase is done. Jeffersonian ideals of expanding into the West for an agricultural type society. People wanted land, they wanted their independence, and they thought that the best way to get independence was land, so they could go do agriculture this way. Well, and as the country is expanding to the West, and when I say into the West at this time frame, we're talking like Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois are like on the far fringe at this point. So it's slowly moving out this way. And as it moves, and people are getting involved in this aspect of agriculture, the grain crops and stuff like that, obviously there's some subsistence going on, there's some reciprocity going on, exchange, but many people didn't really want to just end at that. They were looking to produce some volumes to get some extra commodities into the market. Well, the market was all housed on the East Coast. So as people moved west, this aspect of the market revolution was taking on. And the market revolution, and I'm trying to do this very, very, very briefly so I know I'm going to be missing things, is the aspect of the expansion of canals and roads. And these are very rudimentary roads, to say the least, and early railroads moving out into the countryside and bringing more of that product into those eastern markets. 1825, the Erie Canal comes in. DeWitt Clinton wanted to make New York City the center of commerce for the nation, take it away from potential competitors like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston and stuff like that. So the Erie Canal stretched across the state, went over to Buffalo, and was this aspect of bringing in some of those really far west grain crops in. So as the market revolution is going on, there's also a transportation revolution that coincides with it. The development of individual trains, Robert Fulton and the steamships, keelboat design improvements, all these aspects to take advantage of the new transportation routes. Communication revolution is slowly coming on of how we expand the U.S. mails and get information to and fro so that people understand what crops are available, what the prices are, when the market's buying and selling and all that. So the nation as itself is expanding during this time frame, slowly further west. And as a result, when you get to like northern Illinois, the early 1830s, most of northern Illinois was still inhabited by Sauk and Fox Indian tribes. Now, southern Illinois was slowly getting filled with white populations down there in the American bottom, connecting with St. Louis. But northern Illinois was still very Spartan, to say the least. And with the push going out there, more people wanted land. So, hence some treaties, which is a whole messed up story in itself, pushing those Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. The Black Hawk War comes on. In 1833, the Indians lose the war. They're officially pushed past the Mississippi River, and all of northern Illinois is this clean slate. There's only 1,310 people in the entire northern third of the state. Chicago is just a handful of settlers there at best. So what happens with this clean slate? The Indians are gone. This Western migration's coming on. This transportation revolution, communication revolution, market revolution. What happens? So
that's the story, man. That's the story.
Oh, yeah.
That's the introduction to the story,
Absolutely.
And the interaction, I think, between the Native Americans is, I think, really fascinating, especially the Black Hawk War. But I was wondering if you could briefly touch too on how slavery was interfacing with this story, and also the role of women at this stage of the game as well.
Now, are you talking like on a national level or within my region, or like I did national down?
No. I think we've reached your region. I think we've reached the Northern Illinois story right now, and I kind of, I think that's what's interesting to the Chicago listeners, at least, is what I think we now know briefly, but what happened to the Native Americans, because it wasn't a clean slate before, but now it is because of the Black Hawk War. But the other component, though, I think, is the discussion of slaves and the role of women as well.
Well, slaves on a national level, there's not a lot that occurs in the United States of America from the early Republic to the Civil War that is not in some way, shape, or form influenced by slavery. It is a massive, massive historic motivator, shall we say, of events. With the market revolution, there's a sectionalism issue going on. There's a real drive to push in the North the expansion of the railroads and the canals and stuff like that. The drive in the South wasn't as strong. And therefore, that set the pace for the, shall we say, the sectional division of market revolution, of the power of it in the North, the weakness of it in the South. And the North, at the same time, was bringing in a lot more immigrants. Immigrants could work in the growing factories that were coming on in places like Lynn and Lowell and stuff like that. I'm trying to think of a way to succinctly talk about the divisions that were going on, the sectionalism at the time. And a lot of it was just driven by this slave system within the South. Within my research region, there's very little influence of slavery directly, other than there's lots of Underground Railroad things that's going through my individual counties. In the early time frame, the early 30s, there were some potential servants, because that's what they were called in Illinois, servants. Slavery was outlawed. You couldn't have slaves, but they had tweaked the text enough to allow individuals to bring in their black servants. Now, the black servants had to be registered. They had to, there are all kinds of rules and regulations that control the lives of these. And all it was a masquerade for slavery. It was more prominent in southern Illinois, and there were some cases in the northern tier of the state. But slavery obviously just kind of played a big role, if nothing else, in influencing who came to the northern states from, as far as immigrants from European countries, because they didn't want to compete with slave labor in the South. And therefore, a lot of those people settled into Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania. And then as those populations grew, they were looking for land, so they moved west. So if you look at, and Illinois is a classic case, if you look at the people who came into southern Illinois, you see lots of North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia people coming into southern Illinois. Northern Illinois, very few of those come in. Most of them are immigrants straight from the old country, or New York is huge, Pennsylvania. Once again, a lot of those mid-Atlantic New England states. So slavery is kind of driving who's moving into the West, as far as the West and the South in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, or into the West in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, so forth. And the ideologies of those people transfer with them. So if they're pro-slavery in South Carolina and they move to Georgia and then move to Mississippi, that slavery ideology just transfers with them. The Irish that come into New York and then end up in Chicago and then move west from there, they're not into the whole slavery thing. So I think that's the best way of describing how slavery plays in at this time frame, without getting into a very long discussion on that aspect. The role of women is so underscored in history. It is amazing how little has been done on that. And the funny thing is, if you look at the last 20 years, the amount of books that have come out in women's history, it's a major change, and there's been a lot more. But it's not even close to enough to talk about the contributions that women have made in American history. And in this time frame, women's role was extraordinarily key, because most people were farmers into agriculture. Manufacturing hasn't really kicked in yet. It's slow in certain areas. but it's still a very predominantly agricultural society. So men are usually focused on as far as gathering that big crop at the end of the harvest so that they could turn that in, sell that to pay their taxes or pay their mortgage or what have you. Same with livestock, slaughtering the pigs in January and stuff like that. But those occurred in small pockets of time. What a lot of people don't realize is that the day-to-day survival of most of the families was dependent on women. Women did little, collecting feathers, making butter, collecting eggs, home textile issues, that type of stuff. As far as barter and exchange and selling to general stores so that they could get by day to day, if it wasn't for women, a lot of these men would be very hopeless. And there have been some stories, or historians, I apologize, that have done lots of studies on this aspect of kinship communities, where large families actually benefited from having so many family members, having so many men to work the fields, so many women to do these day jobs and to help in the fields, and then children that contributed to family incomes. And those that were not part of these kinship communities actually suffered because one guy or one woman are trying to do the work of so many. So women and children just don't have the same historical background yet in the historiography that I feel that they deserve. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that a lot of them weren't landowners. A lot of them couldn't own land, couldn't testify in court or what have you. So they were denied access to a lot of what would end up being potential primary sources. But many of them, luckily, were very good writers, kept diaries and stuff like that. So that contributes to adding to their success. Individual men that moved to the West, if you were an artisan, maybe a blacksmith or a carpenter or something like that, you could have a good chance of success in the West, in my region. If you came out as a single farmer trying to run a farm by yourself, the chances were nil that you would succeed. You needed that family base for the extra work that they did, stuff like that. So the role of women and children in early Republican antebellum is just extraordinarily crucial.
Wow. And so we have all these moving parts, these components, this larger national Western expansion, this play between the North and the South now, plus slavery, plus women. And now we get back to your region and the rivalry between St. Louis and the emerging Chicago. And can you give us a feel about what happens next, and specifically what Northern Illinois looked like back then?
Well, initially, Northern Illinois back then didn't have a whole lot. Like I said, there's only 1,310 people in the 1830 census for the entire northern third of the state. So an occasional farm. Fort Dearborn obviously was on the lake, and if you look at the population, I think there's like 15 people at Fort Dearborn in the 1830 census. Then, yeah, it wasn't like this massive fort like we know them today. So there was lots of open prairie and timber sporadically throughout, and timber became very important as far as establishing early homes. But the lack of timber also played a crucial role in the growth of Chicago, because Chicago became this massive receiver of lumber from Wisconsin and Michigan and stuff like that, and filtered it out to the west. So there was also the Illinois River was kind of like the big player, because it if you follow the Illinois River up to the Des Plaines River, it actually comes to a continental divide. There's a continental divide just southwest of Chicago. Now, it obviously does not have the same grandeur that the continental divide in the Rocky Mountains have, but everything on one side flows one way and everything on the other flows to the Atlantic. And when there was enough water in this one region where this continental divide was, there was an actual, you could portage across the Des Plaines River into the Chicago River. And they identified this really, really early, going all the way back to Marquette, shall we say. But in 1826, the U.S. government decided that what we're going to do is we're officially going to put a canal here, because this would be the link between the Mississippi River in the east. That declaration is what kind of drew everyone's attention to northern Illinois. Because everyone, remember, Erie Canal happened in 1825. Extraordinarily successful. Helped make New York. Put them on the map. The amount of travel that went through. Towns popped up overnight. Majorly successful. A year later, they declared that, okay, the federal government's going to pay to put a canal from Lake Michigan to the Illinois River. So there was an excitement in the air as to what was going to happen here. Towns started to pop up, lots of paper towns, and a paper town is something where they had actually planned a whole town with city halls and schools and roads and stuff like that, but it never materialized just because they couldn't attract people to whatever specific location they were going after. So as these towns popped up, many of them popped up along the river or the potential I&M, Illinois and Michigan Canal route. And then people started to swell out after that. They would take up 120, 200, whatever acres to start doing farming to bring their potential farms to what would be the eventual canal route. So as this area was growing, both in small communities and farms, it had to decide what are we going to do with these crops in the meantime. I mean, we can't harvest 100 acres and sell it at the local small general store. We need to take this somewhere. So we can either take it to the river and pay for the travel down the river to St. Louis, or we can take it across land to that little Chicago thing that's on the lake. And many people in my research region, which were beyond a day's route from Chicago and actually closer to the Illinois River, decided to incur the expense of traveling overland to take it to Chicago versus the shorter trip to the river and paying it down, because then they had to pay for transportation, and St. Louis was paying a lot less per bushel than Chicago was, because Chicago was very aggressive in their economic movement. They had what were called boosters, people that attempted to boost the appeal of Chicago, therefore drawing in immigrants and migrants and business and everything to their locations. St. Louis was really apathetic at the time. They kind of figured, look, everything goes downriver. We're right here at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri. Illinois is right up there. Everything's going to come. We really don't need to put all this effort in. So as they're kind of sitting there being lazy about it, Chicago is going gangbusters, attracting attention to themselves, and they're going out and reaching people like William Ogden, who was the first mayor of Chicago, walked out to my research region, which was, once again, 2-3 days, depending on where you went to, by foot, and worked with people in LaSalle and DeKalb County, building connections, building relations, loaning money to them, getting investment dollars for them, connecting this research region in those very early years that Chicago was still just a tiny little village on the lake shores. And if it wasn't for the true expansion into distant markets like LaSalle and DeKalb, Chicago could have been relegated to just what was within normal walking distance, which would have made it no different from Gary or Milwaukee or any other port on Lake Michigan. But because it was so aggressive about going the next step further out in those early years and attracting them in, and then working with the connection with those canals, and then later in 1848, the Galena Union Railroad, they were able to show that they could expand beyond. And by this time, they expanded all the way to the Mississippi River and beyond. But that initial step was in my research region, which makes it so important in deciding whether or not Chicago or any other city on Lake Michigan or village on Lake Michigan was going to be the success.
Wayne, do you think people know, like regular people like me, like know this story about Chicago?
A historian named Bill Cronin did this book in 1991, Nature's Metropolis. And he talks about some aspects of this, but he talks about it from Chicago's point of view, and then he just talks about the hinterland. Some of what I've described, people like Bill Cronin has talked about. Don Miller wrote a book, City of the Century, that deals with Chicago. They don't talk about, though, specifically the role my region played in the initial stage. They just talk like they got stuff from the hinterlands. Okay, they got timber from Wisconsin or Minnesota. They got grain from Illinois, Iowa, or they got hogs from Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, or whatever. They don't talk about it stair-stepping in. It doesn't identify the fact that if it wasn't for my region in those early years, someone else could have picked up the ball and run with it. So that initial story definitely exists. It's been covered very well by those historians. It's the next step beyond that. I want to illuminate this aspect of, well, who in the hinterlands played what role and when, and how important was that role? Now, how many people have read Don Miller or Bill Cronin? I don't know, but I think the average person outside the Chicagoland area, there's very few that have an understanding of the events that occurred in 1830s and 40s.
So why is it important then? Why is your research important for us, the average reader or the average consumer of information?
And I've been working on 6 years coming up with a good answer for that. Well, no, urbanity gets a lot of the spotlight. Chicago is very significant. We know that. But without the hinterlands, without the rural societies, no urban center would exist. There is definitely a symbiotic relationship, economic, social, political, going back and forth between these. And to identify what's happening in northern Illinois, the entire northern Illinois story has not been told at all. So when people look at Illinois, they see this strong, early southern Illinois building in the American bottom. They hear about Chicago, and they hear about Lincoln. Those three subjects, if you're really attuned to history, are the three main stories of Illinois, which leaves a whole chunk of the state out. And understanding what's happening in rural Illinois, in the rural Midwest, as far as these early years, helps us understand what happens in the Civil War. It helps us understand in the post-war buildup. The rest of Northern history is made by what these individuals do here. It's extraordinarily key. And trust me, that's something I'm still developing.
No, that's fine. You and I discussed what Northern Illinois physically looked like, and I think I remember you telling me that it was mostly swampland at some point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Most of if you looked at the Wisconsin border, the Illinois-Wisconsin border, and kind of put a finger up in Lake County and a finger up in Galena, and came down in a triangle. Most of that area was very marshy. If the very first road to Galena, and Galena is extraordinarily important up there on the Mississippi River because that's where lead was produced. It was one of the major national lead producing regions, so it has its own distinct history that flows into Wisconsin that is quite different. So there was a real desire to connect with Galena right away. So if you look at the growth of Chicago and Galena, you would think if you drew a straight line between them, that would be the best way to go. But actually, if you look at the roads, they kind of head southwest for a long distance, come into just past DeKalb County, and then head off to the northwest. So they take this triangular route. And what they're doing is they're avoiding all the marshy swamplands. I mean, roads were bad enough during this time frame as they were because they were dirt roads, and whenever it rained, they became bogs. They were hard to move on. But most of that region was marshes and swamps. And if you look at the old initial surveys done in the 1820s and 30s in those time frames, you can see they're scattered throughout the region. So it just made travel through them that much more difficult. And I'm not 100% sure when, I think it was in the 1860s or 70s, lots of internal improvement programs went into draining those swamps, making those areas more inviting to residents and to agriculture. And that's, if you think about it now, when it rains, sometimes a lot of those regions get lots of floods, or you walk out into the school playground and the grass and your feet squishing it. That's because that's what the soil is it was for thousands of years. And even our attempts can only hold so much back.
I want to thank you for kind of telling us your personal story and your emotional journey from how you went to the military, went to the corporate world, and then kind of landed at academia. And then I want to thank you for sharing your story about your research. It's very obvious that you have a passion about it and that you think it's important. And I also think it's an important story to tell. The time period is often overlooked in our history broadly, and I think you're definitely right about the hinterlands of Chicago being completely overlooked by everyone. So I'm very happy that you're there illuminating these stories for everyone else, and that you're paving a path for future historians to kind of expand even further. Now, I did kind of want to switch gears right now, if you're up for it.
Oh, absolutely, Jake. You know that.
And I'm not exactly sure if you'll be okay with the subject, but I'm gonna throw it out there anyway.
Okay.
What can your period of history tell us about Trump's rise to power and Trump administration?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I've heard lots of discussion from historians of comparing Trump and his process to Andrew Jackson. And what I mean by that is most of the people before Andrew Jackson were statesmen, professional politicians, educated. They had been grooming themselves their entire lives for such position. They had a background in individual roles, cabinet roles, what have you, so that they had a grasp of the political machine at the time. And a lot of people during this time frame in the country were there was a growing amount of discontent towards those. They had this elitism that went with them. They trust us, we know better, because we just do. We're gentlemen, we're elitists, we're educated. We know, just listen to us. And after a while, that becomes a little much for your common man to handle. He doesn't have a great bit of empathy towards those people, especially when you can.
Wayne, are you reading this week's headlines, or are you talking about the antebellum period of?
Well, I know, right? And
history?
that's why a lot of people are talking about this stuff, and that's why it's such. And now there are historians that say, "Well, don't compare them. That's not." There's major differences, and there's some people say, "Well, look at a lot of the different or the things that are coincidental between these two," because that was Jackson's thing. He comes along and he doesn't have the education. He's not quite as poor as Trump was, or Trump wasn't as poor as Jackson was, but he comes from, shall we say, this non-elitist aspect. Now, of course, Trump had his money from his father, and the whole backing of Jackson and the whole backing of Trump is this: we're sick of all these Washington people telling us what is right, what is best, because they know better. Just trust us, type thing. So there is a decided similarity between the backing of these two individuals, their constituents. And then some people have gone on to make the connection. But you think about how Jackson thought about blacks. He owned slaves, so he was a racist. He obviously had a major role in displacing the 5 tribes in the Southeast, so he's a racist. Well, and then you already hear the stories a lot about Trump and his racist things going on. So there are similarities between these two. I guess, what would be a potential takeaway is Jackson's era came to an end and things switched. So, Trump's era will come to an end and things will switch. History does repeat itself that way. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. And despite all the damage, depending on who you wanted to talk to, that Jackson did during his time frame, things developed from there and got better. The way the South viewed him with nullification, of course, the treatment of the Indians, his attack on the Second U.S. Bank, some of these major issues that played in. And it wasn't so much that Jackson was a genius at these things. It's just he was there at the right time, and if he could fight someone, he did. Which, once again, am I talking about Jackson or am I talking about Trump now? The similarities are definitely there. But once again, once Jackson was done, once Martin Van Buren, his successor, took over and then didn't do exactly what he said, once Polk got in there, and who was Jacksonian but did some of his own thing, things eventually did play themselves out. Things will play themselves out for Trump here. Just for those that are anti-Trump, they have to just, I hate to say they have to be patient, but he is president. He's going to be president until something happens or elected out of office. So be patient. Stop being apathetic about whatever your political goals are. You need to be involved. You need to get out there and vote. You need to get to be informed on these things, which is, some of the same issues that Jacksonians had to deal with. His attempts at nullification and the Second Bank of the U.S., a lot of it was things that were spun by the media, good or bad, spun by Nicholas Biddle, spun by Jackson. Well, you need to go out there and find out for yourself, not just, read a meme on Facebook. Figure out what's going on. Political apathy is probably the most horrific thing that has occurred in the United States in the last 40 years, if not longer. So, if you're pro-Trump, stay involved. Learn what's going on. Are these things that Kellyanne Conway, that Steve Bannon, and Donald Trump, are they meeting the goals that you thought they were going to meet? Are they telling you the truth? And I'm not here to say that they are or aren't. just either way, you need to find out for yourself. Don't, once again, go on social media. Don't go on these things and listen to what your opponents are saying. Find out for yourself. The information is out there. In this day and age where, we have to question, or there's a debate on what is news, what are facts type of thing. No, facts don't change. Okay, interpretation of facts can change, manipulation of facts can change, but facts don't change. The sources for the facts are still out there. Go get them yourself. Make decisions for yourself. And if you're happy with what he's doing, once again, stay involved. Try to inform your other people. If you hate what he's doing, find out for yourself, stay involved. So, I think the connection between Jackson and Trump can be made this aspect of both are issues that caused great division within the country. The entire second party system came about as a result of Jacksonian politics. And one of the best things that came out of it was this ability for people to become involved in politics. People today, become involved, understand what's going on, learn for yourself. I don't know if I got on a tangent there. Preaching, shall we say.
Nope, love it. Absolutely terrifying. I am absolutely terrified, but it's good to hear that we're doing the exact same things over again over the last 100 years. But it is also a little refreshing to hear that maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and it's also refreshing to know that we could just look 100 years ago at what Jackson did, or the lead up to what created Jackson, and to see that we're not so different after all from our great grandparents.
Well, and Jackson had to deal with the same thing that protects us now. Jackson had to deal with the system of checks and balances. He had to deal with Congress. He had to deal with Supreme Court. Yes, it was very rocky at times. There's times they got along. Jackson just couldn't go willy-nilly without dealing with that system of checks and balances. Donald Trump can't do the same thing. And if Hillary won, she couldn't get away from that. There's no way of getting away from checks and balances. That's why it's there. That's why we should all feel that, it's not like it's all hell in a handbasket type of aspect coming on. There are procedures in place to keep some of that in control. And if you look at any president throughout history, they've all had to deal with that. Some have been more successful than others, when they have their party in. But, it's there for a reason, and God bless the founding fathers for putting it in there for us. So there's another takeaway from history that, presidents can't go totally rogue, do whatever they want. There's something in there to keep them in check. And no matter how much Congress loves or hates a president, no matter how much the Supreme Court loves or hates a president, usually there's enough people on all of them to understand that, no, they're all here for the American people, and that's what we have to take care of.
Again, absolutely terrifying. I hope you're right. I'm
trying to play middle ground here, just to be polite. Not trying to devolve any of my political opinions at the moment.
As am I. I would never want to alienate half of my audience. Sorry, 51% of my audience. The other component to the show, and I think we've gotten through kind of the majority of the topics, but the other component to the show is technology, right? So we talked about your industry, if we can call academia an industry, and we talked about thought leadership, which I do very much consider you to be a thought leader in your field, Wayne. Just because of your non-traditional student success and kind of because of your journey and your path, and how well you're able to articulate it. But the other component is technology, and I don't think there's a lot of people talking about technology, the intersection of technology and history, especially not the intersection of new emerging technologies with 19th century history as well. So I was wondering if you can kind of give us a background, a primer on it, and maybe give your forecasting for the future about how it's going to change the field or influence the field.
Well, technology and history go hand in hand. You would think that history kind of static and technology is so fluid that they hardly come together, and that's not the case. In fact, for the historian, technologies are massive in our ability to influence our ability to get information and to share information. Digital humanities is massive. More and more primary sources out there are accessible online now. And if you think, 20, 30 years ago, when historians were doing their research, writing these books, coming up with these arguments, they literally had to do the old card catalog thing. They had to go to the library to get books. And if they wanted to see these archives, see these primary sources that are spread all over the globe, they physically had to go there and see them. Okay? Many governments, national governments, federal governments, state governments, local, they're putting some of these things online. Different historic societies are putting these online. The accessibility of these sources are immediate in many cases. And then with databases, we can go into other libraries, see what they have, do interlibrary loans. The ability to access information has grown so wide that the actual expectations on historians today are, I think, much more difficult than they were 30, 40 years ago. You still had to have enough sources to defend your argument. You still had to do proper history. But here, have you checked this source? Have you checked this source? Have you checked that source? We know you don't have to travel to all these sources. So, the archives that we have to go to, that we have to tap into to answer our questions are at our fingertips. So the expectations go along with that. Of course, the whole computer, the typing, the editing, the word processing aspect of it increases that. So the amount of time that you're allowed to actually work on a project and have some final product, I think has shrunk tremendously.
Wayne. Hey, Wayne.
Yeah.
Let me just cut to the chase, man.
What's that?
How is artificial intelligence, how is virtual reality going to affect history?
That is a wonderful question. I really haven't got into the artificial intelligence aspect of it, unless one of the things that online courses are big, MOOCs are really big these days, or they're growing in interest. So unless some of the basic survey course stuff, your U.S. History 1, unless they program that into an artificial intelligence thing, and that is able to teach a MOOC at that point, maybe there will be a division between your basic historical learning and your advanced historical learning. I don't know if anyone's ever thought about that, or I'm sure when it comes to AI, teaching history is probably way down the ladder as far as that's concerned.
Well, maybe not just teaching history, but the implications and consequences of history itself, like the knowledge base of the 19th century. I feel that there's going to be some advancements in the near-term future when we have these, currently contemporary emergent technologies like AI and VR coming into it at the fold. Can you see any applications where that could increase our knowledge base?
The only thing that, and Jake, hopefully you realize Wayne has not gotten any better on his tech skills over the years. Unless AI can come along and help us interpret mass amounts of statistical data. Allow us to see things that we haven't been able to see before.
Which it does.
Yeah, which it does. But and once again, I don't know how it's programmed in there, what have you. And when I say massive amounts of data, I mean looking at data from the U.S. over a 50-year time frame, census data, multiple levels and stuff like that. So the potential for giving us another tool to help interpret massive amounts of data, AI may come into play. I actually think history is going to be one of those fields where many people actually enjoy history because of its separation from a lot of the major technologies and what have you. There are, many people love connecting on the computer, looking at these massive intellectual things that go on, AI, Higgins boson, all that massive stuff. But we're still humans that can only compute so much data at one given time, and we love stories, and that's where history comes in. So, maybe history's role with artificial intelligence is the fact that it is not corrupted by or dictated by artificial intelligence. It actually acts as a place to get away from it, a reprieve from it, shall we say. So maybe our role is to be more of a connection with the human base, shall we say.
That's an interesting perspective. In terms of experiencing 19th century history, VR probably is going to come into play relatively soon. Trying to build immersive environments from your time period, building a VR simulation that looks and feels and all that sort, like DuPage County in 1833, I mean, being able to have a completely immersive environment like that is going to be game changing, I think. Probably a lot for, battlefield types of simulations as well, especially, for the Civil War. But, you are going to have a responsibility, Mr. Wayne, when the AI developers and the virtual reality developers come knocking at history's door. You're going to be the preeminent historian by then, and you're going to have to give them some answers.
Well, yeah, no, and virtual reality makes a little bit more sense now, because I believe the Civil War Preservation Trust is already working on virtual reality battlefield scenario type things. The concept of connecting with a newer, younger audience is something that history is never going to be free from. And if you think about what they did at the Abraham Lincoln Museum in Springfield, okay, most presidential libraries are very standard museums, very typical with paper and artifacts that they can actually see. Whereas when they designed the Lincoln Library and Museum in Springfield, there's that first thing you go into that talks about the roles of a library, and it's all done through. It's not really virtual reality, but it's a lot of industrial light and magic type stuff with ghost figures. And in the end, you don't even know if the guy who's portraying the librarian is real or not. But it draws in people. People, when they leave those different shows at that facility, they remember it and it sticks with them versus your standard docent standing up there and telling you about it. So, if you want to continue to draw in crowds and get them interested in history, there is a responsibility, I think, for all historians and museum personnel to how do we bridge that gap between the classic standard museum thing that is always interesting, the ability to see a copy of Lincoln's original Gettysburg Address is fascinating. There's nothing you can do with virtual reality there, but bringing his life or a battlefield, or let's walk around Fort Dearborn in 1830 using VR. You really get a new sense of the scope of things, an appreciation. And that is how you're going to draw in more people to be interested in history. And, being interested in history doesn't mean you have to be a historian. You have a better appreciation for it. You develop a love for it. You may want to support it, So, tapping into that younger base that, they're used to gadgetry and stuff like that. Those are avenues that I think any historian needs to potentially think about.
Absolutely. And we're hitting the 2-hour mark right now. And what I like to do at this point, Wayne, is I like to put you on a lonely island. And you're on a lonely island, and you only have one book to bring on this lonely island. What is that book? Out of your 4,000.
Well, hopefully it's the one I write in a couple of years.
That wins you the Pulitzer.
Daniel Walker Howe wrote for Oxford. It's entitled "What Hath God Wrought," and it's kind of this comprehensive look at the early Republic to the antebellum period. Oxford does a series of these for different time frames. James McPherson did the one that's after that called Battle Cry for Freedom, which is very popular. But Howe's What Hath God Wrought, which comes from the first communication over the telegraph, I believe. It's such a nice, long, comprehensive history of my time frame that encompasses so much political, social, economic aspects, but it tells a story the whole time frame. I would say of all the books right now in my life, if I had only one book, that would be the one I would enjoy the most reading on a deserted island.
And the person that you would like to have a conversation from the most during your period? Or it doesn't have to be your period, just in history in general.
Well, I'm actually going to cheat and go with my period. When I was an undergraduate in Northern and starting to look at primary sources, I went off campus and I started to look at local historic societies. And I went to LaSalle County Historical Society and went down and told them what I was doing. And I asked them if they had any journals or diaries or something. And what they did is they gave me access to the set of diaries that have never been used before, never been published in any way, shape, or form, from Amos Ebersol is the gentleman's name. And I know you've heard me talk about this guy quite a bit. And he wrote a very intense diary for several years. And not just your standard diary entries like raining today, chop corn. He went into long things about his financial dealings, about his dating of his future wife, issues about slavery and presidential elections, what was going on. And it's become a cornerstone of my dissertation research because of the complexity and depth of his writing. So the ability to sit down with Mr. Ebersol after spending so much time with his diary and then obviously learning about his family and his home and all that kind of stuff, and being able to ask him all those questions that I have to fill in those gaps, I think that would just be a tremendous treat. So a guy Excellent. No one's ever heard of is the guy I would like to speak with.
All right, and I'm putting you back on the island for just a moment. The musical record that you would bring, just one.
Oh, wow.
To the lonely island.
Well, I'm kind of old school when it comes to this. I think, as you recall, I'm very eclectic in my music choices, but I'm either going to go with Dark Side of the Moon or Led Zeppelin 4, or some classic. Something I still can't get sick of.
Good. Good choice. And if you could put one website in the back of your pocket, what would you bring? Which website would you bring to the island?
Ancestry.com.
Nice. Excellent.
I can get lost in that
I've heard, I think I found the best answer from one of my podcast guests. They said Wikipedia. I'm like, of course, that makes the most amount of sense. But Ancestry is also a very, very good
I've
choice.
seen so many entries in Wikipedia that are blatantly wrong. I don't know if I would go with it.
Fair enough, man. Well, Wayne, Mr. Wayne Nelson, soon to be Dr. Wayne Nelson, soon to be professor of history at some prestigious college or university. It has been an honor talking to you, and I think the audience has learned so much about you, your passion for history, and I think they've also learned about your time period and about what the nation felt like during your time period, and especially about Illinois, about the interesting tidbits about the rivalries between St. Louis and Chicago, and that there was only 1,310 people in northern Illinois in the 1830 census. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time, man, and I really appreciate you coming onto the show.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, man. Is there any final parting advice you would like to tell the audience about history?
There's so much I would just like in a few words just say, don't ever think of history as that boring static thing that you may have encountered in high school. There is so much more to it, and I feel with the right historic guide at your side, you'll find that it is an extraordinary tool to understanding who you are, where you can go, and the possibilities that exist. So history is dynamic. It is occurring now. It is never going to stop occurring. So there's always wonderful life in history.
Great. And do you want to plug your university's history department?
Yeah, the Iowa State University History Department. We've got our own Facebook page. Obviously, we're on the web. I haven't asked permission, so I won't announce my advisors right now, but I could not have handpicked a better group of individuals to guide me on my journey. Many of my cohorts that I talk to, they feel good when they've got one or two. I literally have all five of my committee that just fit like a perfect glove. So and I mean that dead serious. Some things were just meant to be, and this was meant to be. So to the Iowa State History Department, God love you. I mean, I'm glad I am here.
Wayne, we wish you the best of luck with your dissertation and with your comps, and we wish you the best of luck continuing your journey into history.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it, man. All
right, that was Wayne Duerkes. Again, sorry, Wayne, for calling you Wayne Nelson the entire time. I think that's his middle name, Wayne Nelson Duerkes, and that's how he goes on Facebook, Wayne Nelson. So if you want to reach out to him, go find him on Facebook. For me personally, talking about history in such depth and detail was enormously gratifying. And I can't give him enough props for being who he is. He is just a wealth of information and a great guy all around. Hope to have him on again. So anyways, hey, we got a sponsor, and it's Corporate Suites Network. CSNhousing.com. CSNhousing.com. They are Chicago's premier vendor for short-term rentals and corporate housing. Month-to-month apartment rentals, furnished apartments, they got you covered. So go over to csnhousing.com and check them out. Until next time, everyone, bye-bye.